In the summer of 2014, reports of brutal murders began to appear in Moscow's crime reports in Russia, mostly occurring at night in deserted places. At first, they were almost unnoticeable in the general information noise. A man's body was found in Kuskov Park with signs of violent death. Another one on Izmailovsky Boulevard. Then more and more. At first, it seemed like the tragic routine of a huge metropolis. Domestic conflicts fueled by alcohol, fights among those who had hit rock bottom, but something was alarming, standing out from the usual pattern. The signature, it was too recognizable, too brutal, too devoid of any apparent logic. The victims weren't robbed. No one took their last pennies, mobile phones, or documents. They were simply deprived of life with some kind of extreme, methodical fury. Multiple blows with a hammer turned the head into a bloody mess. Dozens of stab wounds, as if the executioner fell into some kind of trance, unable to stop. Few people at the time could have guessed that behind these brutal crimes was not just a thirst for profit or a random outburst of aggression, but a neo-Nazi ideology. The desire to cleanse the city of outcasts, or more precisely, the justification of their crimes by this desire, and even a twisted craving for fame. Who were these phantoms with hammers and knives who took to the streets of Moscow to carry out their bloody justice? It took investigators quite some time to come up with the theory that this wasn't the work of a lone madman, but rather an entire, albeit small, yet surprisingly tight-knit gang. A group of young people whose acquaintance was not made in a courtyard or on a college bench, but in the anonymous depths of the internet. Their cradle and at the same time incubator of hatred became closed ultra-right communities on VKontakte and anonymous neo-Nazi forums. Here, under fictitious nicknames, in an atmosphere of complete impunity, they found each other. They were united by a burning hatred for so-called outsiders, homeless people, alcoholics, the lumpen, and everyone who, in their opinion, tainted the pure image of the nation and the city. They reveled in the ideas of social Darwinism, considering themselves the superior race and their future victims as biomaterial to be immediately disposed of. They were inspired by the exploits of Alexander Pichushkin, the infamous Bitsevsky maniac, who also saw himself as a forest caretaker, and by a video which I also have on my channel Strashnota. They decided to go further and become the caretakers of the city. The informal leader of this emerging cell of idiocy quickly became Pavel Voitov, who went by the nickname Get Online, a 20-year-old who was bold and already had a criminal record. A suspended sentence for desecrating a Jewish cemetery in Riga did not cool his ardor. On the contrary, it only fueled his thirst for more radical and bloody exploits. He was the driving force of the gang, the generator of ideas, and, as the investigation would later show, the most active participant, whose hands were stained with blood in almost every proven episode. Voitov was passionate about boxing and knife fighting, cultivating in himself the image of a ruthless warrior of purity. Others were drawn to him. Maxim Pavlov, known online as Zakir or Zakirka, was the youngest. At the time of the first crimes, he had just turned 16. Originally from St. Petersburg but living in Rostov, Yaroslavl region, he already had experience with violence despite his age. By the time he met Voitov, he had already committed at least 2 attacks in his region, one of which resulted in a person's death. But at that time, justice did not catch up with him. Pavlov actively moderated nationalist public pages as Vladislav Karatayev or Persik online. The 18-year-old native of the city of Pavlovo in the Nizhny Novgorod region was also a controversial figure. A third group disabled person, registered with a psychiatrist and previously convicted for distributing prohibited substances. He was, nevertheless, a staunch nationalist, obsessed with ideas of racial purity. And finally, Yelena Lobacheva, who operated under the nickname Ruslana Velesova, a 25-year-old Muscovite from Vikino who worked sometimes as a courier, sometimes as an assistant accountant, with a suspended sentence for a series of thefts. Her world was woven from a fascination with gothic aesthetics and horror movies. A tattoo of Chucky, the character from the famous horror franchise, appeared on her arm, along with her gradually growing obsession with the idea of nationalism. In the spring of 2014, Voitov, Pavlov and Karatayev came up with the ambitious idea to go to Ukraine and join the nationalist Azov battalion, where they believed many like-minded fighters were battling. According to some sources, the initiative came from Pavlov, who had contacts in Azov. On June 3, 2014, the trio met at the Kievsky railway station in Moscow. This was their first time meeting in person. They boarded the train full of hopes for military exploits and participation in a real war. However, their Ukrainian campaign ended before it even began. The Ukrainian border service did not let them into the country. The official reasons were different. The underage Pavlov did not have a notarized permission from his parents to travel abroad, and Voitov and Karatayev did not have enough money with them. Disappointed and angry, they were forced to return to Moscow. Unresolved aggression was looking for an outlet. They went to Voitov's grandmother in the Russian district near Moscow. And already on July 4th, 2014 at Golitsino station, the trio committed their first crime together. This is the day that the investigation would later call the official date of the organized crime group's creation. They attacked a married couple who seemed obviously drunk to them. They hit the man on the head and took the woman's bag by threatening her with a knife. They got a little over 40,000 rubles and 2 cell phones. A few days later, Karatayev would pawn one of these phones in his hometown, showing his passport. This detail would later become one of the irrefutable pieces of evidence in the robbery case. Their attempt to become warriors on foreign soil failed, so they decided to start their own war on the streets of Moscow. Pavlov and Karatayev were getting ready to go home. Pavlov's longtime online acquaintance, Yelena Lobacheva, came to see him off. On the platform, she met Voitov and Karatayev. As later events would show, a kind of kinship of souls developed between Voitov and Lobacheva, based on their shared dark interests and views. Lobacheva invited her new acquaintances to her home on Vishniakovskaya Street, which is located not far from Kuskov Park. This meeting became the point of no return. On the night of July 5, 2014, Pavel Voitov, Vladislav Karatayev and Elena Lobacheva went for a walk in the nearby Kuskov Park. This walk turned into their first joint bloody attack, marking the beginning of the terrifying count of the cleaners' victims. The summer night wrapped Kuskov Park in its stifling, velvety darkness. Occasional streetlights lazily picked out the strange silhouettes of trees and the outlines of sleeping estate buildings from the gloom. On one of the benches hidden deep in the alley, a man named Stanislav Yevseyev was dozing. He had worked as a landscaper in this very park for 35 years. He was on his way home after meeting with a friend, had a beer, sat down to rest, and dozed off. He didn't hear how 3 people appeared out of the darkness like shadows, that one on the bench. Voitov's voice was low and muffled, but there was a distinct sense of ominous anticipation in it. He nodded toward the motionless figure, slowing his pace. "Looks like our client is a bum or a drunk." They approached the bench, surrounding it in a semicircle. Yevseyev was breathing evenly in his sleep, his face relaxed and serene. He didn't know that his last seconds were slipping away. Voitov asked Lobacheva to keep watch and, curling his lips in a semblance of a smirk, took one last step toward the victim. In his hand, as if by magic, appeared a short, heavy hammer. He weighed it in his palm, assessing it. The first blow struck the sleeping man's head, a dull squelching sound that made the blood run cold. The victim's head jerked. Then came a second blow, a third, and several more until the body finally went limp. A dark, viscous liquid began to quickly spread through his hair and down his neck. "Now for the main course," said Voitov, pulling a long, narrow knife from his belt. The blade glinted ominously in the moonlight filtering through the leaves. He struck the first blow with the knife, then, changing position, another and another. Voitov struck quickly and precisely, with a frightening methodicalness, as if he were performing a well-practiced task. The blade sliced through flesh easily, striking with a dull thud against the bone. Suddenly, a weak, gurgling moan escaped from Stanislav's chest. His eyes opened for a moment in silent horror. He groaned and then, with difficulty, said, "Guys, why?" Voitov froze for a second, as if surprised by such incredible resilience. Then his face twisted into a grimace of rage. "Because you're scum." He grabbed Yevseyev's hand, who was trying to defend himself with his last strength, and forcefully stabbed the knife into his side, then turned to Karatayev. "Blood, join in." Karatayev shifted nervously from foot to foot. His hand had already slid to the handle of the knife hidden behind his belt. Panicking from inexperience, he delivered the first blows hesitantly and weakly, but then, like Voitov, he got into it and started stabbing the knife deeper. Delivering blow after blow, the accomplices turned the young body into a battered, bloody mess. The blows continued for some time until the man finally went completely still. Blood was everywhere, thick and dark. It soaked into the ground, the grass, and their clothes. A heavy, nauseatingly sweet smell filled the air. Later, even the forensic experts would be surprised during the autopsy. 171 stab wounds and several blows to the head with a hammer. Finally, Voitov straightened up, breathing heavily, and Karatayev lowered the knife. His face was pale, but his eyes were burning with a mad fire. "I think that's all," he exhaled. Voitov nodded silently, nervously looking around. He picked up his hammer and wiped the blade of his knife on the dew-wet grass with disgust. There was not a trace of remorse or doubt on his face, only the cold, grim satisfaction of a predator that had just torn apart its prey. They left the mangled body on the path and disappeared into the darkness of the park as silently as they had appeared, by the artificial canal in the deep shade. Voitov and Karatayev carefully washed their hands and knives of the clotted blood in the dark water. Then the trio calmly headed to Lobacheva's apartment. They greeted the morning with a sense of accomplishment and their own coolness. From that moment, the bloody conveyor was set in motion. Taking lives became a regular occurrence. The core of the gang consisted of Pavel Voitov and Elena Lobacheva, while Maxim Pavlov and Vladislav Karatayev would periodically come from their cities to take part in the operations, as the gang members called their raids. Their signature style was honed with each new episode. The victims were usually people who seemed to them to be antisocial elements, although, as it turned out later, this definition was extremely vague. They attacked at night in deserted places where there were no cameras. They used hammers to crush skulls and knives to inflict dozens, sometimes even hundreds of wounds. Elena Lobacheva played a special role in this gang. Her transformation from a girl fascinated by Gothic aesthetics and nationalism into a cold-blooded accomplice in monstrous killings is striking. Lobacheva's friend Anastasia Soldatova told investigators how Elena changed after meeting Voitov. She started saying that he was really cool. If before, Lena was very interested in nationalist ideas. After meeting Pavel, she became more interested in serial killings. They discussed the philosophy and beauty of death and taking lives, admired the Bitsevsky maniac Pechushkin. They literally worshipped Pechushkin and other serial killers and dreamed of becoming like them themselves. And their goal was to be shown on NTV On Lobachev's computer, which was seized during the search, there was a sticker on the case that said, "I'm Russian." Inside the computer itself, on the hard drives, investigators found folders with telling names like Tenderness and Necessary, which contained hundreds of videos and photos of executions and torture. In her notebook they found a note. The first one has more than 100 stab wounds. Lobacheva herself tried to present herself as just a passive observer during interrogations, claiming that she was afraid of Voitov and his threats. However, the testimonies of other participants and the details of some of the crimes painted a different picture. She wasn't just present, she used a flashlight to illuminate the victims so her accomplices could strike more easily, and according to some testimonies, she even took up the knife herself. It was clear that depriving people of life and watching them gave her pleasure, said Voitov. She constantly talked about torture and dismemberment during the killings. Laughing, Pavlov added. The geography of their purges and the number of victims grew month by month. On July 13th, on Izmailovsky Boulevard, Voitov and Lobacheva kill a man named Valentin Matitsin who was walking home from work. A hammer and knife were left behind, along with his 8-year-old daughter. On July 26th, at the Bryansky post near the Belarussky railway station, Voitov alone kills an elderly beggar known to the locals as Baba Tanya. 2 blows with a hammer, 45 stab wounds. On July 30th, at the same Bryansky post, Voitov and Lobacheva find a new victim under the overpass, a resident of the Smolensk region, previously convicted and living at the station, 35 stab wounds. This was the second marginalized person they had killed, August 2nd. Again, on Izmailovsky Boulevard, Voitov, possibly with an unidentified accomplice, takes the life of a construction worker from Chuvashia. 13 stab wounds. On August 3rd, in Kuskov Forest Park, Voitov and Lobacheva attack a sleeping man. Voitov hits with such force with a hammer that the hammer breaks. Then he takes a knife from Lobacheva and delivers 28 blows, one of them to the eye. Then he drags the body into the bushes, searches it, finds a bag with belongings and keys. He cuts the victim's abdomen from the chest to the groin and stuffs the bag inside. Lobacheva stands nearby, shining a flashlight. According to her, she threw up. On August 7th at Sirenevi Boulevard, Voitov and Lobacheva notice a man sleeping on a bench. This is Nikolai Babin, a master of the meat department. He is stabbed 84 times. Voitov takes his passport and hides it in his stash. On August 21st at Novozavodskaya Street, Voitov, he finds a sleeping homeless man. First he beats him, then stabs him 48 times. On August 22nd, in the city of Odintsovo, Moscow region, Voitov and Maxim Pavlov, who had just arrived, attack a man named Anatoly Kondrashov, who was on his way from work to a date. 46 or according to other sources, 48 stab wounds. On August 31st at the central Moscow Hippodrome, Voitov and Pavlov kill a construction worker from Belarus, Oleg Deikun. Voitov delivers 18 knife blows, then hands the knife to Pavlov, who adds another 51. Shortly after that, they are detained by a police patrol at the Sherepikinsky Bridge. They find a hammer and knives in their backpacks. But Voitov manages to escape right under the police's noses. Pavlov, being a minor, is picked up by relatives a few hours later. He manages to throw the bloodied gloves into a trash can near the police station. On September 13th, in the area of Kursky railway station, Zemlyanoi Val Street, Voitov and Lobacheva attack a private security guard who is heading to his dormitory after his shift. 6 blows to the head with a hammer. The man is found alive and taken to the hospital, but 3 weeks later he dies from his injuries. 20. The 3rd of September. At the station Rabochi Poselok, Voitov deals with a homeless man under the railway bridge. First, he smashes his head with a stone and then delivers 46 stab wounds. Zakirka, Persik and I had already come here before to jump on the homeless man, but we didn't take his life then, Voitov said. Later the next morning, Voitov meets Lobacheva and their mutual friend Anastasia Soldatova at the Belaruski railway station. After telling Lobacheva that he had cleansed the world again, Voitov gives her the weapon used in the last killing. September 28th, Remezova Street. A drunken man, a former boxer, approaches Voitov and asks him to buy him a drink. Voitov punches him in the face, then stabs him 9 times and takes his wallet. Anton Butkovich, the husband of Lobacheva's friend, witnesses this. Voitov intimidates him, demanding his silence. The evening of October 21st, 2014 was settling over Moscow with a damp, chilly darkness. A cold wind was blowing fallen leaves and small, annoying debris along First Yamskaya Street, not far from Belarusky Station. Alyona Shitik, a 40-year-old woman who had come from Belarus to earn a living, was hurrying along a narrow, barely lit path, pressed up against the heating main. She was returning after a long work day, tired but thinking about home, about the renovations in her apartment that she hoped to pay for with the money she earned in Moscow. Shitik wrapped herself in her old jacket, trying not to pay attention to the piercing cold and the gloominess of this deserted place. She didn't notice the dark figure that separated from the wall of one of the buildings and silently moved to intercept her. It was Voitov, out on his next hunt. In his eyes, Alyona, a tired woman in simple clothes walking along the unlit path, instantly turned into just another homeless woman. I think it's clear that the cleanup was just a pretext, since the victims were never checked in any way and in fact were completely random for the most part. So the woman walking home from work somehow instantly turned into biotrash that needed to be removed. Hey you! His voice was sharp, cold, hostile, devoid of any other emotion. Alyona flinched and quickened her pace, instinctively trying to get away from possible danger. But Voitov was faster. He caught up with her in a few strides, grabbed her roughly by the shoulder, and turned her toward him. "Where are you rushing off to, scum?" he hissed. His face was close, his eyes burning with a menacing fire. Before Alyona could answer or scream, a hail of blows rained down on her. Voitov beat her with fury, putting all his pent-up hatred into every strike. Fists crashed into her face and body. Alyona covered her head with her hands, trying to call for help, but the place was too deserted at that moment. The woman stumbled and rolled down the muddy, slippery path into a shallow ravine running alongside the heating pipeline. Voitov jumped down after her on the move, pulling out a knife. His heavy boots landed with a dull thud on the ground. Next to the woman's sprawled body, Elena struggled to get up. The killer who ran up kicked her hard and started stabbing her with the knife. He kept stabbing again and again into her chest, her stomach, her side, her throat. He was in a frenzy. His movements became fast, sharp, almost mechanical. The woman was no longer resisting. Her body only convulsed with each new blow. Blood quickly soaked her clothes, mixing with dirt and autumn leaves. When the unfortunate woman stopped showing signs of life, the maniac paused for a moment, breathing heavily. It seemed that this was not enough for him. The madness that had overtaken him demanded something more, something final. He grabbed the woman by the hair and separated her head from her body. Later, during the identification, the mother, who had lost her life, was shown her daughter's head and body separately. Alena Shitik became the last victim of the autumn series of cleaners. 14 lives in 4 months. Most of the murders were committed with inhuman cruelty, and more often the victims were marginalized individuals. But also ordinary workers, random passers-by whose only fault was being in the wrong place at the wrong time or seeming defenseless enough to the cleaners. The motive of cleansing the city increasingly seemed like a cynical cover for a pathological thirst for blood and self-assertion through absolute power over others. Life, autumn of 2014. Tension is rising in the offices of the Moscow police and the investigative committee. A series of brutal murders with a similar pattern leaves no doubt there's a serial killer or a group operating in the city. But who are they? The investigators are literally going in circles. Difficulties kept piling up one after another. The crimes were committed in different administrative districts of Moscow, in the Moscow region, and even one in the Yaroslavl region, which was connected to the early activities of Pavlov, but later it was possibly attributed to the overall series. Because of the involvement of a gang member, this made coordination and
exchange of information difficult.
The victims were often undocumented, their identities were established with great difficulty and sometimes remained unknown altogether. This deprived the investigation of the opportunity to trace the victims' connections and look for possible personal motives. And the criminals themselves, despite their brutality, acted with devilish precision. They attacked exclusively at night, in deserted places, under bridges, by fences, deep in forest parks where there were no cameras. They used gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints on the crime weapons. They either took the hammers and knives with them or got rid of them, so it was almost impossible to find them. There were usually no witnesses, and the few passers-by who might have seen or heard something gave statements that were too vague. The method of killing was similar. Multiple, sometimes dozens of stab wounds, and then the medical and forensic examination confirmed it. In all these cases, a similar knife was used as the weapon, although not all the wounds were inflicted with it. It appeared everywhere. It was also noted that the killings mostly took place along the Belarusian railway line. This already gave the investigation grounds to conclude that the crimes were serial in nature. Initially, 5 cases were combined into one series. Then 5 more similar cases in the Eastern District became known. There, the victims were first struck on the head and then stabbed. The motive remained unclear. The victims included both homeless alcoholics and ordinary citizens, a construction worker who went out to buy beer, an electrician who went for a walk, a butcher returning from work. This was confusing. Suspicion fell on supporters of Nazi ideology. Relevant groups on social media began to be actively investigated, but for a long time, no direct traces of the crimes could be found in the virtual space. The gang did not boast about their deeds online, nor did they post reports or videos. There was a moment when it seemed that luck was about to smile on law enforcement. In the summer of 2014, after one of the
deprivations of life,
the youngest participant, Maxim Pavlov, was caught by the police. He was detained together with Voitov, but Voitov managed to escape. Pavlov had a knife confiscated, and he was taken to a temporary detention center. There are 18 of those communities. It would seem that this is the lead. But none of the law enforcement officers at the time thought to connect some newcomer kid from Yaroslavl with the brutally murdered man found near the place of the arrest. Pavlov was suspected of theft, but he had nothing to do with it. In the end, after his mother arrived from Yaroslavl, Pavlov was released on his own recognizance, with the detention explained by the fact that he didn't have Moscow registration. The precious chance was missed. The cleaners probably saw this episode as yet another confirmation of their invulnerability. A breakthrough in the investigation happened in the fall of 2014 when the technical capabilities of the Federal Security Service were brought into the case. It was decided to conduct a large-scale analysis of data from mobile operators' relay stations. Operatives and investigators began meticulously studying which phones were within the range of cell towers near the locations of all unsolved killings at the time they were committed. It was a grand task in terms of scale and complexity, but it produced results. At the scenes of 5 killings committed in different districts of Moscow, the same mobile phone showed up. Checking the owner of this number led the detectives to a 25-year-old Muscovite, Yelena Lobacheva. It was already known that in the summer of 2013 she received a suspended sentence for several car thefts. But it was difficult to connect this seemingly fragile girl with a series of brutal murders, where it was clear that physically strong men were involved. However, once they started looking into her circle of acquaintances, the investigators very quickly found Pavel Voitov. It turned out that he often met with Lobacheva, and most importantly, they surprisingly often happened to be together in the very places and at the very times where and when the victims' bodies were later found. The net began to close in slowly but inevitably. After the bloody October of 2014, there was a lull in the activities of the cleaners. Perhaps two factors played a role. With the onset of cold weather, people started wearing thick clothes and hats, which made it harder to deliver fatal blows and to identify victims as easy targets. And also, a subconscious understanding that such a large number of crimes in a short period could not go unnoticed by the police. They decided to lay low. During this winter break, the maniacs met in person with another one of their internet friends, Artur Nartsisov, a 23-year-old Muscovite who worked sometimes in a warehouse, sometimes as a courier. He shared their views and apparently was ready for active involvement. The meeting between Voitov, Lobacheva and Nartsisov, according to some sources, took place in the entrance hall of Lobacheva's building, February 14, 2015. And already the next night, Voitov and his new accomplice Nartsisov went to Krasny Kazanets Street in Vikino. This outing would be the gang's last. Early morning, February 15, 2015. The city is still shrouded in the chilly pre-dawn gloom. Krasny Kazanets Street is deserted and quiet. The frosty air stings my face. Daniar, a migrant janitor, about
45.
walks steadily across the yard toward the utility room to get his tools. His head is filled with the usual morning thoughts about work and problems. He notices two figures separating from the dark mass of one of the buildings and slowly moving toward him along the sidewalk. Just ordinary passers-by. Who knows who wanders around the courtyards this early in the morning? Daniar pays them no attention and continues on his way. He doesn't know that these two are Pavel Voitov and his new accomplice Artur Nartsisov, and that for them, he, Daniar, is no longer just a random passerby, but the next target, biotrash to be eliminated. Voitov is used to his victims being weak and defenseless, and this middle-aged migrant, wandering alone, seems like just as easy a prey to him. They pass by each other. Daniar has almost walked past them when Voitov suddenly turns around. Without a word, he delivers a short, sharp punch to the janitor's temple. Daniar was stunned by the suddenness and treachery of the attack, staggered, but managed to stay on his feet. "Hey, Shaitan, what do you want?" The janitor looked at his attacker in confusion and got ready to defend himself, clenching his fists. Voitov doesn't answer. A knife appears in his hand. Nartisov, hesitating a bit, also pulls out his own. "Finish him, Artur," Voitov commands quickly, and the two of them rush at Daniar. But the janitor isn't going to give up. He tries to dodge the blows and fight back, shouting curses in a mix of Russian and his native language. Voitov, used to the passivity of his victims, is clearly not prepared for such resistance. They try to circle around the victim, to land more precise blows, but the janitor keeps spinning, not letting them get behind him, desperately defending himself. "Cut him, what are you waiting for?" growls Voitov at Artur, who is nervous and acting clumsily. In the chaos trying to get the elusive janitor, Nartsisov accidentally stabs Voitov in the leg with his knife. "Ah, damn it, what are you doing, you idiot?" howls Voitov. From the pain and surprise, he recoils, grabbing his injured leg. This moment gives Daniar precious seconds. He jumps back and shouts at the top of his lungs, "Help, they're killing me!" His cry echoes through the sleepy courtyard. Nearby, a light comes on in the window of an apartment building and a dog starts barking. Voitov, limping and cursing from pain and frustration, realizes that the hunt has failed. There was no easy prey. He gives Daniar a look full of hatred and turns to Nartsisov. "Artur, let's get out of here." Panicking, Artur doesn't need to be asked twice. Both of them take off, disappearing into the morning twilight. Daniar is left alone, breathing heavily, pressing his hand to his neck, which was still slashed by one of the knives. He's wounded but alive. And most importantly, he remembered the attackers' faces, their clothes, their voices very well. The testimony of the surviving janitor became the very key that the investigation had been missing for so long. He gave a detailed description of the attackers. The detectives from the district police department investigating this attack acted quickly. Using footage from street cameras, they were able to track the criminals' escape route. The cameras recorded two men running into the entrance of the building where Lobacheva lived. Naturally, the police began going door to door in Voitov's building. After learning about this from Lobacheva, he called her right after being wounded and asked her to prepare everything for dressing the wound, and then decided to wait it out.
At her place.
He realized things were bad. He became alert and nervous. The noose around them was tightening with every hour. Voitov's arrest happened at the train station when he was trying to leave the city or cover his tracks. He was promptly taken to the First Directorate for the investigation of especially important cases of the main investigative department of the Investigative Committee of Russia for Moscow. And there, during the very first interrogation, something unexpected happened. Voitov voluntarily wrote a confession. He not only confessed to the crimes he was already suspected of, but also told about others that were previously unknown to the investigation. He himself told how he created the group and who was in it. Soon, Yelena Lobacheva was detained. During searches of their apartments, 6 knives, an unregistered traumatic Osa pistol, clothing with traces of blood, including that of a janitor, a hammer, as well as Nazi paraphernalia and Voitov's stash with documents and belongings of some victims were found. After some time, the police apprehended Maxim Pavlov and Vladislav Karatayev. Karatayev, during his arrest in Pavlov tried to take his own life by cutting his veins. The last one to be detained in April was Artur Nartsisov. He was caught in his hometown of Sasovo-Ryazan region for a trivial theft of cream sausages from a store, the agony of the cleaners gang. It was over. The bloody cleanup on the streets of Moscow was stopped. After the arrest of all the gang members, a long and painstaking investigation began. The detainees, realizing that the game was over and that there was more than enough evidence against them, mostly began to confess. They talked about the details of the planned attacks, the distribution of roles within the group, and their motives. Investigative experiments and face-to-face confrontations were conducted. The picture of their crimes was becoming clearer and more horrifying. The forensic psychiatric examination conducted on all members of the gang delivered its verdict. Voitov, Lobacheva, Pavlov, and Nartsisov were found to be fully sane and aware of their actions. Only Karatayev was found by the experts to be of limited sanity due to a mental disorder, but this did not exempt him from criminal responsibility. Their awareness only emphasized the cynicism and cruelty of their actions. V. In April 2017, the investigation into the Chistelshikov criminal case was completed and handed over to the Moscow City Court. At Lobacheva's request, the case was heard with a jury panel. The trial, which began on May 22, 2017, attracted the attention of the public and the media. In the courtroom, a drama unfolded, exposing the darkest sides of human nature. The defendants behaved differently. Voitov seemed to enjoy the attention. At one of the first hearings, he showed up wearing a t-shirt with a runic inscription that read "Only Hate," which had been sent to him in the detention center by his fans. He often smiled, chatted and laughed with Yelena Lobacheva while the judge was reading out the charges or testimonies. The others, Pavlov, Karatayev and Nartsisov, looked indifferent for most of the hearing and sometimes dozed off. The state prosecutor, Yaroslav Mits, methodically presented the evidence of the defendant's guilt to the jury, interrogation protocols, expert reports, witness testimonies, and physical evidence. As he went through each of the 14 episodes of the crimes, he showed the jury photographs from the crime scenes. At the first hearings, some jurors turned away from these horrifying pictures. Throughout this entire trial, they had to see hundreds of documentary pieces of evidence of inhuman cruelty. 100 was the average number of stabs they inflicted, with a maximum of 171 stabs, the prosecutor said in his speech. What, if not this, shows that they were enjoying all of this? This isn't hatred, these are maniacs. In court, Lobacheva's friend Anastasia Soldatova and her husband Anton Butkevich testified. They talked about meeting Voitov and Lobacheva, about their conversations regarding arming the gang, and about threats from Voitov towards Butkevich after he witnessed one of the attacks. Both stated that after giving their testimony they began receiving threats from nationalist online communities. At the hearings, the relatives of those whose lives were taken by the cleaners were present. Olga Babina, the mother of Nikolai Babin, silently looked at her son's killers, while Vera Tereshkova, the mother of Elena Shitik, couldn't hold back her emotions, shouting curses at Voitov. "You freak! Why did you kill my daughter, you bastard?" "Die. I'll send a message there with a note so they give you a proper welcome." During the entire trial, only once did the mother of Elena Lobacheva appear in the courtroom, but she quickly left without saying a word. Voitov refused to testify in court, invoking Article 51 of the Constitution. However, after his testimony and the investigation data were read out, he stood up and said, "All of this can't be undone, but I sincerely want to ask the victims for forgiveness." This apology sounded especially cynical given his behavior in the courtroom. Lobacheva tried to present herself as a victim of circumstances, claiming that she was just observing, staring at one spot, and was not afraid of Voitov. Pavlov blamed his actions on a difficult childhood and propaganda from the internet. On June 21, 2017, the jury delivered its verdict. All 5 defendants in the case were found guilty of the charges against them. Voitov, Lobacheva, Pavlov and Karataev were found undeserving of leniency. Only in the case of Artur Narcissov were the jurors divided on the question of leniency. 6 in favor, 6 against. October 23, 2017. 3 years and 3 days after the last proven murder committed by the gang, the Moscow City Court announced the verdict. Pavel Voitov was sentenced to life imprisonment. Elena Lobacheva received 13 years of imprisonment to be served in a general regime colony. The Criminal Code of the Russian Federation does not provide for life imprisonment or strict regime colonies for women. Vladislav Karataev was sentenced to 16 years in prison to be served in a strict regime correctional colony. Artur Narcissov and Maxim Pavlov each received 9.5 years of imprisonment, Narcissov in a strict regime colony, Pavlov in a general regime colony. After the verdict was announced, Pavel Voitov shouted to journalists, "I think I was given too much. I was counting on a suspended sentence." His hands were cuffed behind his back, but he tried several times to make a Nazi salute as much as the length of the handcuffs allowed. He kept smirking. The convicted men stated their intention to appeal the verdict. As for the psychology of the gang members, Pavel Voitov is the leader of the gang, the main organizer and perpetrator of the killings. His personality type is a predator, dominant, a narcissist with sadistic traits. His motives are ideological superiority, neo-Nazism, a thirst for power over life and death, enjoyment of cruelty, and a cult of serial killers. His traits are cold, calculating, methodical, obsessed with control. He showed no remorse. He used ideology as a cover for his personal sadism. He was skilled at recruiting and subjugating others. There is no official diagnosis, but there are signs of psychopathy with a narcissistic component and narcissistic personality disorder. His attitude toward killings was one of pleasure and ritual. He often inflicted dozens or even hundreds of blows himself without feeling any pity. Elena Lobacheva, an accomplice and friend of Voitov, helped and participated in the killings. A histrionic personality with elements of dependent and deviant structures, motives, attachment to the leader, search for belonging and uniqueness, admiration for violence, escape from a boring life into fantasy and cruel reality. Traits: compliant, suggestible, prone to imitation. She was interested in gothic culture, horror, and serial killers. She enjoyed the process. She has, or at least has, traits of presumably borderline personality disorder with possible secondary sociopathy against the background of dependent relationships. She highlighted the victim's behavior, participated in the torture, and during interrogations tried to present herself as a victim of circumstances, but other participants refuted her statements. Maxim Pavlov Zakir, the youngest participant, joined at 16. His personality type is aggressive with growing sociopathy. His motives are ideology, desire for recognition, copying elders, admiration for maniacs, and desire. He has weak traits, is emotionally dull, easily manipulated, lacked stable moral guidelines, shows signs of adolescent form of dissocial disorder, possible early psychopathic tendencies, and his attitude towards deprivation of life. At first, he was confused, but then he got involved. He tried to justify himself by blaming the influence of the internet and a difficult childhood. Vladislav Karatayev-Persik, third group disabled, previously convicted, was registered with a psychiatrist. Personality type is vulnerable, mentally unstable, with a distorted need for belonging and recognition. Motives: belonging to a group, striving to be significant despite marginality. Traits: insecurity, anxiety, tendency to submit, but aggressive in a pack. Diagnosis: limited sanity with a mental disorder that does not exclude responsibility, likely schizotypal disorder or residual form of schizophrenia. During the deprivation of life, his behavior started with indecisiveness, then he followed along. During the arrest, Artur Nartsisov, who later joined in one of the attacks, tried to commit suicide. Personality type: secondary imitator, follower. Motives: desire to join the heroes, assert himself, neophyte aggression. Traits: insecure, prone to panic, unstable. He failed the task, harmed the leader, after which the gang essentially fell apart. Diagnosis: presumably socially infantile type without pronounced psychopathic traits. His behavior was clumsy. He accidentally wounded Voitov and when caught turned out to be a thief and a petty loser. The general traits of the gang are ideology, neo-Nazism, a cult of cleansing the city of the lower classes, and a binary way of thinking. We are pure, they are filth. Psychological state: the group intensified each other's aggression, erased the boundaries of what was permissible, and turned taking lives into a ritual and a means of self-assertion. Violence was an end in itself. Numerous blows, dismemberment, scenes of torture not for profit but for the feeling of absolute power. And if you want an analysis of your personality, of course, it won't be anything that extreme. It will be, for example, what professions suit you or how anxious or stressed you are. In general, something like that. I'll probably leave a link to the post about how to get it below the video. Justice has been served. The members of the cleaners gang received long sentences and the leader got a life sentence. But the story of their bloody deeds left not only scars on the city and grief in the families of the victims, but also a number of uncomfortable questions. What drove these young people, who grew up in ordinary if not always prosperous circumstances, to a path of inhuman cruelty? Only neo-Nazi ideology, falling on the soil of personal insecurities and a thirst for self-assertion? Or was there a flaw in their psychology from the start, a readiness to cross the line? Or was it simply a series of coincidences, like when someone becomes successful, but here someone becomes a criminal? The internet became a place for them to meet and become radicalized, but it's just a tool. They could just as easily have met somewhere on the street behind some garages. The phenomenon of the cult of Pechushkin and dreams of dubious fame through violence point to deep infantilism and a distorted perception of reality. Well, or immaturity. And what do you think about this case? Leave your comments, like or dislike, and watch other videos on the Strashnota channel.